In 1881, a president was shot after just 4 months in office. His name was James A. Garfield. Today he is one of America's most forgotten leaders, but his story is one of the most extraordinary in US history. A self-made man, a war hero, a scholar and a president, whose death changed America forever. This is the story of the man who should have been remembered, but wasn't. The wilderness of Ohio in 1831 was a vast and largely unmapped frontier. In a small clearing in Cuyahoga County, 16 miles from the growing town of Cleveland, James Abram Garfield was born into a life of extreme poverty. His home was a single-room log cabin, built by his father, Abram. It featured small windows made of oiled papers and gaps between the logs that were filled with clay to keep out the winter winds. Life in this isolated forest was a constant struggle for survival. Tragedy struck the family before James reached his 2nd birthday. A massive wildfire began racing toward their cabin, threatening to destroy everything they had worked to build. Abram Garfield met the flames with a desperate energy. He dug trenches and hacked away the brush to stop the fire's progress. He was successfully in saving the farm, but the efforts broke his health. He was seized by a violent cold and died within days, leaving his wife, Eliza, to raise 4 small children on her own. The years that followed were defined by a type of deprivation that was harsh even by the standards of the rural frontier. Eliza was forced to sell most of the family's lands to pay off debts, and she farmed the remaining acres herself with the help of her oldest son, Thomas. The circumstances were so dire that James did not have a pair of shoes of his own until he was 4 years old. Neighbors and relatives suggested that Eliza give the children away to more prosperous families to be raised, but she refused. She was a woman of immense pride and dignity, qualities that she passed on to James. Even as a small boy in ragged clothes, he walked with his head high and his shoulders squared, refusing to be ashamed of his status. Eliza came from a lineage of intellectuals, and she was determined that her children would have the opportunities beyond manual labor. She donated a portion of her own land for the construction of a neighborhood schoolhouse. Education, she believed, was the only way to escape the grinding poverty of their lives. When James turned 11, the age when most boys began working full-time on nearby farms, his family made a significant sacrifice. His mother and his older brother Thomas insisted that he stay home and focus on his books. They famously declared that no matter what else happened, James must go to school. James, however, harbored different ambitions. He had read books about the ocean and developed a deep longing for life at sea, despite the fact that he was hundreds of miles from the nearest coast. At the age of 16, he left his mother's cabin to find work on the Ohio and Erie Canal, the same canal his father had helped build years earlier. He took the lowliest job available, working as a driver for a crew of men who were often rough and occasionally violent. He was fascinated by the work and the environment, though he recognized that he was in danger of being ruined by the vices of his companions. He could not even swim, and he later confessed that he almost knew nothing about the water beyond what he had found in literature. The course of his life changed on a dark night in the middle of the canal. James was alone on the bow of the boat, trying to untangle a coiled rope, when he lost his balance and fell into the deep, black water. He had fallen in more than a dozen times before, but those incidents had always happened during the day when other men were on the deck to pull him out. This time it was midnight. The rest of the crew was fast asleep, and no one heard his cries for help. As he struggled in the cold water, certain that he would drown, his hands caught the very rope that had caused his fall. With a massive effort he pulled himself back onto the boat and collapsed on the deck. When he examined the rope, he was stunned to find it was not secured to anything. It should have slipped off the deck and into the water after him. Instead, the rope had caught in a small crack along the edge of the boat and knotted itself just enough to hold his weight. He sat there in his wet clothes, shivering in the night, and realized that his survival was not a matter of luck. He believed that Providence had saved him for something greater than a life on the canal. He returned home shortly after his near drowning, but he was a very sick young man. He had contracted malaria and was so weak he could barely walk. He reached the cabin at 9 o'clock in the evening and heard his mother inside, praying that he might be returned safely to her. James spent the next several months in bed, as a recurring fever threatened his life. When he finally began to recover, Eliza told him that she and Thomas had managed to save $17 while he was away. She urged him to use the money to return to his studies, rather than going back to the rough life of a canal man. James took both the advice and the money. By the fall of 1851, he had abandoned his dreams of the sea and transformed into a passionate student, determined to make a mark on the world. The recovery from his years on the canal brought a transformation that few expected. He arrived at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in 1851, with a mind finally hungry for something more than the sea. Because he lacked the money for tuition, he convinced the school to let him work as a janitor in exchange for his education. He spent his early mornings hauling wood, making fires, and sweeping the floors of the modest red brick building. He made no attempt to hide his poverty from his fellow students. He walked to the bell tower every morning with an unconscious dignity that observers never forgot. The school promoted him from the janitor's closet to the assistant professor's podium. He taught classes in literature, mathematics and ancient languages, while still finishing his own degree. By the time he reached his 26th year, he was serving as the school's president. His ambition only grew as he moved east to Williams College in Massachusetts. He found himself surrounded by the sons of wealthy families who had enjoyed every advantage he had been denied. Rather than being intimidated, he viewed his classmates as competitors, to be outpaced. He spent time calculating the power of the other scholars in his department. He wrote to a friend and declared that out of 42 classmates, 37 shall stand behind me within 2 months. He graduated with honors 2 years later, a man who had mastered every lesson and conquered his own limitations. The academic piece of his life ended with the outbreak of the Civil War. He left the Ohio legislature because he could think of nothing but the safety of the Union. He entered the army as a lieutenant colonel and was soon promoted to colonel of the 42nd Ohio Regiment. Many of his recruits were his former students from the Eclectic Institute, who followed him from the classroom to the camp. His first major trial came in January 1862, at the Battle of Middle Creek in Kentucky. He faced a Confederate force that was 2,000 men strong and equipped with a battery of cannons. His own regiment was smaller and lacked artillery. Its commander was a young academic who had never seen a day of combat. He spent the night before the battle hunched over a map by the light of a lantern. He traced the mountains and deep valleys to devise a plan that was as daring as it was deceptive. He divided his small force into 3 separate groups and launched a 3-pronged attack from different directions. The Confederate commander became convinced he was being surrounded by a mighty army of thousands. The rebels retreated in a frantic disarray, and the victory turned the young professor into a national hero. He rose swiftly to the rank of brigadier general. The victory left a hollow place in his soul. Walking across the dewy meadow after the fighting, he saw the bodies of his soldiers and realized his own clever strategy was responsible for the carnage. He told a friend that a sense of sacredness of life went out of him that day and never returned. His commitment to the Union cause was inseparable from his hatred of slavery. He had been an ardent abolitionist since his youth. He had once hid a runaway slave in defiance of the law. When the famous abolitionist John Brown was executed in 1859, he mourned it as a dark day for the country. He wrote a short phrase in his pocket diary that served as his personal creed. That phrase was "Servitium esto damnatum," or slavery be damned. He believed the war was a scourge sent by God to punish the nation for the horrors of the slave system. Even in the halls of Congress, where he later served for 17 years, he fought for the rights of freed men with passion. Path to the presidency opened at the 1880 Republican National Convention in Chicago. The party was split between the stalwarts, who wanted the 3rd team for Ulysses S. Grant, and the half-breeds, who supported James J. Blaine, or John Sherman. He went to the convention specifically to nominate Sherman. He watched as the stalwart leader Roscoe Conkling gave a fiery speech that whipped the crowd into a frenzy. When his own turn came to speak, he decided to carry the mind of the convention in a different direction. He stood upon the table and looked into the sea of flushed faces. He began his speech by comparing the convention to a human ocean in tempest. He reminded the delegates that the height of the waves is not a true measure of the sea. He argued that it is the calm level of the sea from which all depths are measured. He used this as a metaphor for public opinion. He suggested that the true verdict of the nation will be found at the thoughtful fireside of the American people. The speech was eloquent and reasonable. A voice from the crowd shouted that the party wanted him instead of the candidates he was praising. The balloting began on Monday and dragged on for 2 grueling days. No candidate could reach a majority. On the 34th ballot, a sudden shift occurred as Wisconsin threw its votes to him. He leaped to his feet in protest. Stating that he had not given his consent to be a candidate. He was told to sit down. A stampede followed on the 36th ballot, as state after state abandoned the frontrunners. He won the nomination against his will with 399 votes. He was shocked and sickened by the result. He told a friend that he feared his friends had ruined him. He sat in silence as the hall erupted in cheers, a grave and thoughtful expression on his face. The campaign of 8080 found its heart in a quiet farmhouse in Benter, Ohio. This home, which reporters eventually called Lawnfield, became the center of a new kind of political outreach. James Garfield chose to stay at this farm rather than travel the country seeking votes, as he believed that a candidate should remain dignified and wait for the people to come to him. Thousands of visitors made the pilgrimage to his veranda every week. These visits became famous as the Front Porch Campaign. People arrived by every train to hear him speak. On a single day in October, 5,000 people converged on the farm despite the heavy rain. Garfield greeted them with a warmth that was entirely natural to him. He even addressed a group of German immigrants in their own language, which was the first time a presidential candidate had given a speech in a language other than English. Significant support for his candidacy came from the most respected voices in the nation. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and human rights leader, spoke to an integrated crowd of thousands at the Cooper Institute in New York. Douglass told the audience that Garfield had burst through the poverty that surrounds the poor, to show how an American can rise. He stated with total conviction that he is right on our questions. Douglass urged his listeners to make Garfield more famous by sending him to the White House. The tension of the contest reached a breaking point on election night. The race was exceptionally close and remained uncertain until the final hours. Garfield watched these returns with a calm that astonished everyone around him. When he woke up a few hours later and learned of his victory, he was the coolest man in the room. He recorded the event in his diary with a simple note, stating that the news of 3 a.m. is fully justified by the morning papers. This victory did not bring him the joy that his supporters felt. He viewed the presidency not as a grand prize, but as a bleak mountain that he was not obliged to ascend. He felt a deep sense of loss as he realized that his quiet life of books and farming was over. He wrote to a friend that there is a tone of sadness running through his triumph, which he could hardly explain. While Garfield prepared for his administration, a different kind of conviction was forming in the mind of Charles Guiteau. His life had been defined by a long series of failures in law, ministry, and communal living. He had spent years at the Oneida commune where the members had nicknamed him Charles Guitout because they wanted nothing to do with him. Guiteau lived in a world of religious delusions. He believed he was God's Minuteman. He frequently claimed that he was in the employ of Jesus Christ and Co., and viewed this as the strongest firm in the entire universe. His survival relied on a level of audacity that few could imagine. He traveled between cities by train without ever buying a ticket. When conductors asked for his fare, he simply explained that he was doing the work of the Lord and had no money. He later boasted that the Lord took care of me, because he was working for him. Couteau eventually became obsessed with the political spoils system. He spent every day in a Boston library working on a campaign speech that he believed would change the outcome of the election. When Garfield won the nomination, Couteau simply changed the name on the speech and became convinced that he was responsible for the victory. He believed that he deserved a political appointment as the consul in Paris. He moved to Washington and visited the White House nearly every day, handing his card to the doorman and waiting in the anteroom with hundreds of other office seekers. He even managed to speak to the First Lady at a public reception, telling her that he was one of the men who had made her husband president. The political war between the president and the stalwart faction of the Republican Party consumed Couteau's thoughts. He read every newspaper account of the conflict between Garfield and Senator Roscoe Conkling. On the night of May 18th, a sudden thought struck him like a flash of lightning. He believed that God was telling him that the president must be removed, so that the Republican Party could be united. He hesitated at first and prayed for a sign that he was wrong, but the idea only grew stronger within him. Finally, he became convicted of the divinity of the inspiration. He decided that I must remove Garfield to save the Republic. He viewed this act not as a crime, but as a practical necessity, requested by a higher power to end the political chaos of the nation. The morning of July 2nd was a beautiful one in the capital. James Garfield woke up early and played with his teenage sons in the White House. He was full of energy and health as he bounded through the halls. The president was looking forward to his trip to Williams College. He planned to attend his 25th class reunion. He rode to Baltimore and the Potomac station in a small carriage with James Blaine. They talked about the political future of the nation as the horse moved slowly over the streets. The station was a massive building made of red bricks, with an imposing Gothic design. Garfield entered the waiting room with an easy and natural confidence. He did not have any guards or assistants with him. He simply walked arm in arm with his friend. Charles Couteau was standing in the shadows of the room. He had been watching the doors for over half an hour. He wore a dark suit and a slouch hat. As the president passed, Couteau stepped out. He moved within 3 feet of his target and reached for his revolver. He claimed he had a petition for the president before he pulled the trigger twice. The sudden noise of the shots filled the station. The first bullet hit the president in the right arm, and the second bullet tore into his back. Garfield threw up his hands in shock. He cried out to God and asked what happened. Then he collapsed. He fell heavily to the carpeted floor and began to vomit. A bright red stain appeared on his summer suit. The station turned into a place of horror. People screamed and ran in every direction. Robert Park was the first man to reach the assassin. He grabbed Couteau by the neck and wrist. Officer Kearney rushed to help him. Couteau did not fight much once he was caught. He was afraid of the angry crowd. He heard men shouting that they should lynch him. He turned to the officer and said he wanted to go to jail. He told the man that he did it and would go to jail for it. He shouted that Chester Arthur was president now. Garfield lay on the floor in intense pain. Sarah White ran to him and placed his head in her lap. She gave him water to drink as tears streamed down her face. Doctors began to arrive within minutes. They did not yet understand the danger of germs. They put their unsterilized fingers into the wound in his back. They used silver probes to search for the lead. Garfield did not scream during the examination. He told the doctors that he would take whatever chance he had to live. A group of men carried the president upstairs to a room above the tracks. He lay on a mattress made of hay and horsehair that was stained with blood. He worried about his wife, Lucretia. He told his friends to send her a telegram. Finally, the cabinet decided to take him back to the mansion. The ride was slow and somber. The driver moved the horse carefully to avoid the holes in the brick streets. Hundreds of people walked behind the wagon in silence. When they reached the White House, Joseph Stanley Brown was waiting. He was shocked by the sight of his friend. Garfield was pale and his suit was torn. He looked like a skeleton of the man who had left that morning. As the men carried him up the stairs, Garfield looked at his secretary and tried to smile. He told his son Jim that the hull was damaged, but the upper story was fine. He was alive, but the long struggle for that life was just starting. Dr. Willard Bliss took absolute control of the medical team, pushing away the president's long-term family physician. Bliss and the other surgeons did not believe in the new theories about germs or the need for clean hands. They repeatedly searched for the bullet by sticking their unwashed fingers and silver probes deep into the wound. These examinations created a long infected channel that was far away from the original path of the lead. Bacteria entered the president's bloodstream and began to ravage his body from within. Alexander Graham Bell arrived at the mansion with the hope that science could find the bullet without further cutting. He used an invention called an induction balance that detected metal through sound. During the tests, Bell heard a confusing sputtering noise that made it impossible to pinpoint the lead. He later discovered that the surgeons had failed to mention a layer of steel wires inside the mattress. This hidden metal interfered with the electrical current and rendered the experiment useless. Garfield suffered through 80 days of increasing physical decay. His weight dropped from 210 pounds to a mere 130 as he slowly starved. Because he could not keep food down, Bliss ordered a series of rectal feedings made of beef bouillon and egg yolk. This method failed to provide enough nutrition or hydration to sustain a dying man. Abscesses filled with pus broke out across his skin and even paralyzed his face. Through all this agony, Garfield remained kind to his nurses and tried to comfort his wife. He finally told those around him that his work was done and he was ready to go. The American people lived in a state of constant tension while waiting for the medical bulletins posted on newspaper billboards. The tragedy united the divided country as citizens from the north and south prayed for the man they now viewed as a brother. Even the poorest families in shanties tore up their clothes to drape their homes in black as a sign of respect. In a final attempt to find relief, Garfield was moved by a special train to the New Jersey coast. He died there on the evening of September the 19th, 1881, after a sudden, sharp pain struck his heart. His funeral procession in Washington was the largest the nation had ever seen, with a line of mourners stretching for miles. Charles Couteau stood trial in a courtroom packed with spectators, who carried picnic lunches to keep their seats. His defense team argued that he was a victim of insanity. Couteau frequently interrupted the proceedings to insult his own lawyers and declare his sanity. He insisted that the shooting was God's act and that the doctors were the ones who truly murdered the president. The jury took less than an hour to find him guilty. On June the 30th, 1882, Couteau was led to the gallows. He stubbed his toe on the way up to the steps and recited a poem in a high voice before the trapdoor fell. Chester Arthur stood in his parlor at 2 in the morning, a changed man. The politician who once shined Roscoe Conkley's shoes now faced a country that feared his every move. He watched his predecessor suffer through 80 days of avoidable agony. Public anger at the political system that produced the assassin reached a breaking point. In 1883, Arthur signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This law stripped power from party bosses. Hiring became based on merit rather than personal favors. Arthur had been a loyal follower of the spoils system for years. Yet as president, he transformed into the man the nation needed. He refused to do Conkling's bidding and worked to earn the respect of a skeptical public. The tragedy at the White House forced a reckoning in American medicine. For years, surgeons had mocked the idea of invisible germs. They preferred their unwashed hands and bloodstained coats as marks of experience. The autopsy of the president revealed that their probing fingers had done more damage than the lead bullet. This failure eventually ended the era of surgical stink. Future lives were saved through the adoption of antisepsis. Joseph Lister's theories were finally accepted in the United States at the cost of a president's life. James Garfield's place in history began to fade almost as soon as he was buried. His presidency lasted less than a single year, leaving behind few official acts. He became a figure defined by his death, rather than his life. He was the son of pioneers who cleared land and built a life out of the wilderness. He was a man who escaped the woods of Ohio to reach the highest office through love of learning. His life provided a map for what any American might achieve starting from nothing. He understood that progress required honesty and courage to face reality. Near the end, he reflected on clarity that comes with the close of life. He believed that regardless of the pain, the truth will set you free. History remembers the loudest voices, but sometimes the quietest ones change the world the most. James Garfield was one of those voices. Let's not forget him again, eh? Bye.